The trip that I had a chance to go to in Israel, there were several different parts to it, and so Paul actually gave me it was generous enough to allow me to speak twice on this. The first part we talked about walking in the footsteps of Jesus. And there were lots of different pictures, and we had the opportunity to look up as he walked around the Sea of Galilee and the different things that took place and the miraculous things that happened there. His place that he grew up in Nazareth, his hometown of Capernaum, and several of those incidences. We also had the chance to look in and around Jerusalem as he walked those streets as well. Well, part two is where others have walked, people like Abraham and the children of Israel and King David, even before King David, Saul and Jonathan, Hezekiah. And we're going to skip the part where Jesus was. We've already touched on that in part one, but we're going to jump ahead and leap over that section right there and look even further into the New Testament and look at the Apostle Paul and some places that he ended up being. We're going to have a chance to look at a section, though it's not mentioned specifically in looking at Masada right here, that time frame is definitely mentioned. And so looking at the Jews who fled Jerusalem when the Romans came in to destroy it, and some various things at the very end right here. I want to start with something that's only been discovered in the last few years. You see the gate in the middle? This is called Abraham's Gate to Damascus. And maybe you're thinking to yourself, wait a minute, when was Abraham ever in Damascus? Well, I'm glad that you asked. In Genesis chapter 14, you've got the story of the kings that are fighting against one another. You got 4 kings on one side, 4 kings on the other side, and Lot and his family get caught in the middle. And he is taken off as captives here. And Genesis chapter 14 tell us that when Abram heard that Lot had been taken captive, he called his men, 318 trained men, and he went in pursuit as far as Dan. Dan is in the far north part of Israel, and so he goes all the way up there and he goes through. This gate was covered in dirt and rubble and all kinds of things right here. They've already done some work on it. It's about 4,000 years old. And it would have been the gate on the way towards Damascus, very likely, that Abraham would have gone through to go and get Lot and his family and bring them back. I think that's an amazing sight. Again, you'll see the cover of it, and they're doing a lot of excavation work around it at this particular point because they know of its value because of the age of it. You see her? We were just driving by, and he said, oh, do you see that up there? And we all stopped. We weren't even stopping. We were just slowing down in the bus right there and taking photos as quickly as we could. But in Genesis chapter 18, you know the story of the angels who come to tell Abraham and Sarah a couple of different things. They tell Sarah she's going to have a son, and she laughs, as does Abram. But they tell Abraham a different story afterwards. God decides for himself. Am I going to keep this secret to myself, or will I tell him what's about to take place? And he talks in chapter 19 about what's going to take place to Sodom and Gomorrah and the other areas around it. Lot goes back to live in Sodom, he and his family. He doesn't want to leave Sodom, and so the angels of the Lord show up and help them out in their moving. They tell him to get out. They tell him not to look back. But you know the story, don't you? As they're leaving the city, Lot's wife turns back to look at her beloved city and turns into a pillar of salt. I'm not sure this is the place or not, but it's been this for hundreds, maybe thousands of years that people have been looking at this particular place. Doesn't that look like a woman? And it has been since, as long as anybody can remember around there, that's always been considered Lot's wife and the pillar. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. We were in this particular region again down further south, and we had the opportunity to look across this huge expanse. We were up on the hill looking down, and this is down in the Negev, down in what's called the South Country. It's an area where the children of Israel may have camped before entering into the land of Canaan. It was large enough for that exactly to take place, for those things to have happened. You see a big kind of flat area. There are water streams. You can't see it from this picture right here. Do I have my little, there we go. See this little area right here? Those are trees. This little area here are trees, which tells you that there's water there. As you come across even further over here, more than twice the width of this picture, it flattens out even more with more trees and more springs, which you would have to be able to take care of a couple of million people. The South Country. Well, okay, that's fine. It was supposed to have on there Deuteronomy chapter 34, where Moses climbs Mount Nebo, and the Lord showed him the whole country, including the Negev, and the whole region from the valley of Jericho and those palms as well. We had the opportunity to go over to Jericho. As the children of Israel come in, if you continue with the story, they come into the land of Canaan, and the first city that's conquered is the city of Jericho. They claim that it's the oldest inhabited city in the world at this particular point. And it's a nice little area. Some of the different men and women got to ride a camel around during this time right here, and I didn't put pictures of that on there because I thought it was too goofy, but they were walking up and down right here. But I was intrigued by what was behind the little fountain, because you see behind the fountain here this huge hill, and the huge hill has been excavated, and there are walls and pieces of walls. And in Joshua chapter 6 and verse 2, God says, "See, I have given Jericho into your hands." This isn't a made-up story. This isn't a bedtime story. This isn't a children's story. This is a story that actually took place. And there's the thing that's so incredible about these things, when we're talking through apologetics and we're looking at some of these things in archaeology, these places are still there. And people are coming by the hundreds and thousands to come and look at places like this, not just to have faith, but to bolster their faith even more and to strengthen their faith also. It's amazing when you look at that. There are areas where you can find the different chunks of rock they thought it was probably the first walled city, one of the cities that seemed to be impregnable. But you also have Joshua chapter 6 and verse 20. The people shouted a great shout, and the wall fell down flat, and they came in and they took the city. As they've excavated this hill behind what is now modern-day Jericho, they found that to be exactly the case. The walls didn't fall inward, as you would imagine if you have an army on the outside that's trying to get in. They're not pulling the walls toward them. They're pushing them in, as normally you would see. But that's not the way these walls fell. The shepherd's field in Bethlehem. We move along to the time of Jesse. And this is in and around Bethlehem, just outside of Bethlehem. And again, I was struck by just how close it was to Jerusalem. Let's go. Can we go back one? Can you go back one on that, guys? Maybe. Maybe not. Okay. Here we go. Well, that's fine. We're fine with that. At the first part of that, if you could see right back here, you see the tall buildings? That's Jerusalem. So Bethlehem is right there, very close to Jerusalem. It says 5 miles away, but in my mind, I'm getting a picture that it's a little bit further. It's got a few hills. It's right there, very close. David was raised in these areas in what's called, still to this day, the shepherd's field. Samuel makes a visit to Jesse. Saul has been pushed to the side. He is unfit to be king, and God has called David to be his king. And so he makes a visit to where Jesse would have been, and he brings all of his sons before him, doesn't he? Except one. Where do you find him? Oh, he's out in the field tending sheep. And Samuel says, we're not going to sit down, we're not going to eat, we're not going to do anything else until he gets here. And you know the story is he takes his flask and pours the oil over David's head and anoints him the king of Israel. Well, while we were there, we had to look at this particular area. You know what the Valley of Elah is and what took place? David and Goliath. The mountain here, and then I didn't have a wide enough screen to be able to show you the mountain on the other side over here, but that's where Israel and the Philistines would have been camped on either side of this, and down in the valley. You remember Goliath coming down and challenging anybody. Send your best over here. Let's have a fight, and instead of all of us dying right here, let's just have these two go at it, and let's see what takes place. And Saul and the Israelites are assembled, and they're camped in the Valley of Elah, and they drew up their battle lines to meet the Philistines. You remember what happened in the story? There's still a dry brook in the Valley of Elah. Where did David go? What did he go do? Guess what I have in my office? I have 5 smooth stones. Now, my wife told me, she said, you know they have a great big huge dump truck that shows up about every third day and dumps a bunch of those out there. And you just picked up a bunch, you just helped the economy a lot. Let me have my fantasy, okay? I still have the 5 smooth stones right here and still remember the story again as David chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and he put them in his shepherd's bag and he approached the Philistine. I love that. But things don't go particularly well for David. He has to go on the run. Saul is doing everything he can to try to kill him. And he finds himself in a place called En-gedi. En is the well of. Gedi is just the name of the place right here, but it is the wells or the springs of Gedi. And indeed it is. If you were to look, you could have looked all over the place right here. If you were very far away, all you would see was desert with a few palm trees up. But you get into the area of the palm trees, and there's some areas like this where you have not just palm trees, but you have reeds and you have waterfalls. And it reminds us, after Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told David is in the desert of En-gedi. You remember the cave incident as well, where he cut off part of Saul's robe, and he's, just to let him know, I could have taken your life, but I didn't do that because I'm not going to raise my hand against the Lord's anointed. If you go on through the story, remember we talked before last time that we visited right here about the city of Jerusalem and how the old part of the city was good-sized. But we were talking about it, and even in this picture right here, it has the picture of what's called the Old City, but during the time of the 1st century. The city of David was much smaller than that. In fact, this was what it began as, just this section. Solomon came along later, and you see the walls just above it right here with the 2 little doors. That's the entrance into Herod's palace in that area. That would have been where the temple was. And it grew, and it became much more than that. But King Solomon summoned into his presence all the elders of Israel and all of the chief leaders, and to bring up the Ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion, or what was called the city of David, and that was the hill of Zion. When you begin to look at a map just of how big it is, again, this right here was the city of David to begin with. You know that it expanded several different times after Solomon got through with it. Jerusalem is much bigger. Then there is the destruction that takes place because of the different, the Assyrians and the Babylonians come in. Nehemiah comes back and he expands it even further and grows even more. And then when Herod came along, he expanded it even more than that. But you get a little bit of an idea of just the size of this. We had a chance to look at a place called Beth Shean. And looking at Beth Shean, it existed until way into the 4th century AD. The Romans made it a major city. In fact, it was the best preserved city that we saw the whole time we were there, other than Jerusalem. And Beth Shean has baths. It has, you see here, the theater. In fact, we had somebody stand in the middle of the stage right here as we sat out there on the stones. And they never had to raise their voice, and they didn't have to use an earpiece, and they didn't have to use any of that kind of technology to be heard completely. I mean, just like I would be talking with you face to face. It was amazing to see that. But there were a lot of other things. This is more of the time during the Romans afterwards. It was an important city right here. And you see the streets right here and the columns that are lined up on both sides. This existed until well into the 4th century when earthquakes destroyed the city. But I wasn't as interested in that. I kept thinking to myself, there's something more about this city of Beth Shean, isn't there? And I remembered an Old Testament passage. And our leader, Yossi, said, do you see the hill up here? And you see the road that's going up on the hill? That's the old city of Beth Shean. And do you remember that when Saul and Jonathan died, they died on Mount Gilboa, but they placed the body on the walls of Beth Shean. And so even in looking at this, you have this picture of what God is doing throughout the ages. We had the opportunity after that to go to a place called Dan. You remember what happened at Dan? You see the priest there lighting the fire. This is just an aluminum representation of what the altar, because you'll see at the bottom of the altar the outline of this big square, very likely where the altar would have been. This is probably, I'm guessing, 12-foot square. Hard to get that that idea of how big it is right here, but about 12-foot square. When I thought of an altar, I'm thinking of just a little box, just something you can throw the carcass up on top of, and that's it. Oh no, much bigger than that. In fact, they had big sacrifices, sometimes with multiple animals. You remember why this is important? Because Solomon's son Jeroboam was a foolish man. Jeroboam made 2 golden calves, and he sat one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan, so that they wouldn't go down into Jerusalem when you have the divided kingdom. Had the opportunity to look at that. This particular picture you're looking at and saying, that is a strange-looking contraption right here. It is the roof line of what's called the Shrine of the Scroll. And it's designed specifically like that because the scrolls had ends on either end that looked kind of like that were rounded, and then you would have handles. And so it's meant to remind you of what is there. On the inside, this is a huge museum on the inside that we went into. This is what it looks like on the inside. See the scroll handle? And every place that you see these are different places all the way around here, including this, where pieces of the Old Testament and other New Testament passages as well are found. They were found in Qumran. They were found the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I thought this one up here was really important. I went up there and stood for a while. And what you find there is the scroll of Isaiah. 700 years before the time of Jesus, when he would have been writing. I love that thought because in it you find all kinds of wonderful passages. You talk about the new kingdom and animals that were at war with one another are now at peace with one another. But you also find this when God asks, whom shall I send and who will go for us? And Isaiah volunteers, here am I, send me. During that same time frame, Hezekiah is having to fight off Sennacherib's army. You'll see this tunnel that's underneath. None of that is visible from the surface. But Sennacherib's army is outside, and they have destroyed town after town and nation after nation. And Sennacherib now and his army, they are knocking on the door of Jerusalem. And the way that they would come in and conquer is a lot of times they would stop up the water sources and the springs. So how are you going to deal with that? Well, you dig a water tunnel. And that's exactly what is here. We had a chance to actually walk through it. A tunnel that was dug 2,700 years ago. This is the pool that it exits out into. It's called the Pool of Siloam. You remember in John chapter 9, the blind man? Where was he told to go wash? There. And so, again, all of this history that's a part of this that you're just looking at and you're going, these stories are real. These stories are true. We know, we see these places that are exactly there. And the passage in 2 Kings chapter 20 reminds us all those other things that King Hezekiah did, and there were a lot of them, a lot of good things that he did. Even how he made the pool and the tunnel by which he brought water into the city. Are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Judah? And so we have, again, written proof, but we also have archaeological proof that this is there as well. Leapfrog from the Old Testament to the time of the New Testament, leapfrog the time of Jesus, and you'll remember a city called Caesarea. Today it's called Caesarea Maritime because it's on the sea. But there is something really incredible about this. We had a chance to walk through this. Again, it was built by King Herod. It has an aqueduct that brought water into it as well that's still visible. But you remember Paul being in jail in Caesarea, waiting for more than 2 years. And finally, he says, if I've committed any of these things right, if anything has happened that I am guilty of right here, I'm not afraid to serve, but if I've done nothing wrong, I appeal to Caesar. That inscription is found right there as well. I appeal to Caesar. I mentioned before, we went to the park that is called Masada. And in Masada, you see this great big huge thing up on the top of the mountain. It actually, this area and this area were two of Herod's palaces. Now, he was crazy, always scared of everybody else right here, but he had like 8 different palaces where he could escape to get away from those who might come after him. But on top of that, here, this section right here is where the Roman army would have camped, and every day would have made that trek up to the edge of the city right here to try to breach the walls to come into the city of Masada. This being about the time of 70 to 73 AD when the Romans came in and conquered Jerusalem and Judea. This is from there. You're seeing the blue area right here. This is the Dead Sea. From Masada, you can see a major portion of the Dead Sea as well. But this gives you just kind of a little bit of a model of the northern palace and some of the palaces that were there during Masada as they were running for their lives. Qumran, where you have the caves and the different scrolls were found. A model version of that. Here are pictures of some of the very first scrolls to be found. And then just some really quick things right here. The first picture has little gods that you would have kept with you, that you would have had in your house. The second picture here is a sarcophagus. Once the meat on the bones have deteriorated after you're dead, then you would take a sarcophagus, if you had a lot of money, and place the bones inside of those. And that's what this is, has been discovered. There have been several of those also. And some of the different artwork that was in the Israeli museum, even some of the weapons of war found all the way back to the time of David and of Saul. The last thing I want to mention right here is one of the oldest passages of Scripture ever found in Israel. It's on a piece of metal, etched into a piece of metal that they have found. And I want to leave you with the thought that is written there in Hebrew. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord lift his face, his countenance upon you, and be gracious to you.